Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Aliens and UFOs video. Alright, let's go ahead and let's do part 2 of chapter 1 from the UFO Sightings book by Alan Baker. This one we're going to go knee deep into some of the other cases associated with this chapter. They specifically have to do with close encounters of the first kind. So the first part of chapter 1, I was just about to get into more of these experiences that people have had. It's interesting that some of these I have already chronicled within my Aliens and UFO playlist, so always interesting to reread them here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let's do part 2, and then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions with regards to this particular video. So here's essentially where it goes next. Next section is called the Gorman Dog Fight. On the night of October 1st, 1948, George F. Gorman was flying with the North Dakota Air National Guard. After the squadron had landed at Fargo, Gorman decided to get some night flying practice and took his F-51 back up. Flying conditions were extremely good. Visibility was unlimited and there was no moon. At 9 p.m., Gorman spotted a small Piper Cub aircraft flying below him, but a moment later he saw another apparent aircraft, or at least a light, which was blinking as it traveled from east to west. Gorman tried to distinguish some structure behind the light, which was easy to do with the Piper Cub, but could see none. He contacted the Hector Airport Control Tower, asking if there were any other aircraft in the vicinity apart from the Piper. The tower replied in the negative, but the pilot of the Piper also saw that blinking light. At that point, Gorman decided to try to intercept the light, but quickly realized that this would not be possible by flying a straight course. The light was moving too fast, even though Gorman's F-51 was flying at between 300 and 400 miles per hour. When the light altered its course, Gorman decided to try for a head-on pass. The two craft were heading straight for each other at an altitude of 5,000 feet. At the very last moment, the light instantly climbed and passed 500 feet over the F-51. The object disappeared momentarily from Gorman's field of view, but quickly reappeared and started another head-on pass. It made the same vertical maneuver as before, but this time, Gorman pulled his own aircraft into a steep climb in an attempt to keep up with the unknown object. The F-51 managed to maintain the climb until it reached 14,000 feet, whereupon it stalled out, leaving the object to continue its race into the night sky. The dogfight continued as the object circled back and began yet another head-on pass, although this time it altered course much sooner and headed out over the airport. Gorman immediately gave chase. Since he knew he was now at 14,000 feet, with the object below him at 11,000 feet, he decided to dive at it. However, the UFO eluded him, climbing vertically once again and finally disappearing for good into the night sky. This encounter ended at 9:27 p.m. U.S. Air Force Project Sign investigators were on the scene within hours and interviewed Gorman, the pilot of the Piper Cub, and the control tower operators. Gorman described the object as a ball of light about 8 inches in diameter. On October 23rd, Gorman gave a sworn statement which ran in part as follows. I am convinced that there was a definite thought behind its maneuvers. I am further convinced that the object was governed by the laws of inertia because its acceleration was rapid but not immediate, and although it was able to turn fairly tight at considerable speed, it still followed a natural curve. When I attempted to turn with the object, I blacked out momentarily due to excessive speed. I am in fairly good physical condition, and I do not believe there are many, if any, pilots who could withstand a turn in speed affected by the object and remain conscious. The object was not only able to outturn and outspeed my aircraft, but was able to obtain a far steeper climb and was able to maintain a constant rate of climb far of excess of my aircraft. Gorman's F-51 was checked for radiation by the investigators, who discovered significant increased readings as compared with an F-51 that had not been flown for several days. The Project Sign team returned to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and concluded that Gorman's UFO sighting was a genuine unknown. The UFO had apparently been nuclear-powered, capable of reaching 600 miles per hour and outperforming a human pilot with ease. According to aviation historian Curtis Peebles, the radiation was the first recorded physical effect from a UFO sighting. How fast do ducks fly? On the night of August 25th, 1951, an Atomic Energy Commission executive and his wife were relaxing in their garden in the Texas town of Lubbock when they looked up to see a large V-shaped formation of approximately 36 bluish lights traveling silently across the sky. At the same time, in another part of town, a group of 4 professors from the Texas Technological College at Lubbock saw the same thing. The lights were apparently attached to a wing-shaped object about 1.5 times the size of a B-26 aircraft. Over the next few days, hundreds of people will report the same or similar objects gliding through the Texas skies. On August 31st, an amateur photographer named Carl Hart Jr. took 5 photographs of the mysterious V formation as it flew over his house. When the photographs were analyzed by the Photo Reconnaissance Laboratory at later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, it was concluded that the V formation of lights had crossed approximately 120 degrees of sky at 30 degrees per second angular velocity. The professors from Texas Technological College had made similar measurements during their sighting and had come up with exactly the same result. Thus, the object was also tracked on radar at a speed of 900 miles per hour, which corresponds to the visual and photographic measurements. The Lubbock reports were also studied by a group of rocket scientists, physicists, and intelligence experts who came to the conclusion that a large object with a highly swept-back wing configuration had indeed been seen. They also speculated that the V formation of bright lights, which were much more intense than the surrounding stars, were caused by the object's propulsion system, a series of jet-like orifices on the wings' trailing edge. However, skeptics were and are unimpressed, maintaining that the Lubbock lights were actually caused by ground light reflected from the bellies of ducks flying overhead. While this is possible and has been convincingly cited to explain other similar sightings, it does, in view of the radar experience, beg the question, what kind of duck flies at 900 miles per hour? The Washington invasion. If the objects tracked by radar around the U.S. Capitol on the night of July 19, 1952 were truly anonymous, then it is hard to avoid the conclusion that whomever or whatever was controlling them had decided to make a serious point. Since some of the UFOs were tracked in the prohibited airspace over the White House and the Capitol, it is possible to draw the inference that the mysterious interlopers were perfectly well aware of the significance of these 2 buildings and of the reaction that could be invoked by an overflight. The so-called Washington invasion began 20 minutes before midnight when a controller at the Air Route Traffic Control at Washington National Airport noticed 8 targets moving at about 120 miles per hour, targets that were confirmed by the control tower's short-range radar. Since the targets were in the vicinity of Andrews Air Force Base, Airport Controller Ed Nugent decided to give the base a call to confirm that they were military aircraft. An airman at the base said that he could see the objects in the sky and told the Andrews Tower to look south. A tower operator did so and saw an orange fireball perform a circular maneuver before shooting away at a fantastic speed. A few moments later, another of the objects left the area. Since 3 independent radar systems, the long and short-range systems at the civilian airport and the military radar at Andrews, had all tracked the same objects, a malfunction was clearly not to blame for the objects. One of the ARTC controllers then asked the pilots of several civilian aircraft in the vicinity if they could see anything unusual in the skies. The pilot of a Capital Airlines flight responded, "There's one, off to the right, and there it goes." Glancing at his screen, the controller immediately saw a target to the right of the Capital aircraft disappear. At about 2 a.m. Eastern Time, another object was tracked by the civilian ARTC flying over Andrews Air Force Base. However, the military radar failed to pick it up, prompting an Air Force captain to go outside to check visually. He spotted an orange-red light between 10 to 15 degrees above the horizon. Meanwhile, another civilian aircraft had reported a light pacing as it made its final approach to National Airport. This visual sighting was confirmed on radar. Harry Barnes, a senior ARTC controller, waited until 3 a.m. and then called the Air Force command post to ask if anything was being done about this highly unusual situation. He eventually got through the combat officer, who told him that all of the information was being forwarded to higher authority and that he would not discuss it any further. According to the combat officer, the Air Force were not really concerned about it anyway, and that somebody else was supposed to handle it. In spite of these rather impressive radar visual sightings, in which the radar tracks have been corroborated by witnesses on both the ground and in the air, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, head of the U.S. Air Force Project Blue Book, which was then investigating UFO reports, did not learn about them until Monday, July 21st, when he read about them in the newspapers. When he flew to Washington from Blue Book headquarters at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, he was treated in a most puzzling way. When he asked for a staff car to go and interview witnesses, he was told there were none available and that he should use the bus. Adding insult to injury, his superiors informed him that he was not authorized to be away from Wright-Patterson and that if he did not return immediately, he would be declared AWOL. At 9:30 p.m. on the night of July 26, the UFOs returned to Washington. When journalist Robert Gaina of Life magazine telephoned Ruppelt in Dayton to ask him what was being done, once again, the Air Force had neglected to inform its principal UFO investigator that the nation's capital was again the center of UFO activity. Ruppelt replied in exasperation, "I have no idea what the Air Force is doing. In all probability, it is doing nothing." Nevertheless, Ruppelt contacted Major Dewey Fortnett, an engineer consultant to Blue Book who lived in Washington, and Lieutenant Holcomb, a Navy electronics expert, and asked them to get to National Airport as quickly as possible. When the two men arrived at 1:15 a.m. Eastern Time, they found Al Chop, the Air Force press officer, already there, and together they watched intently as two F-94 interceptors, which had been scrambled from Newcastle County Air Force Base, closed in on the objects on the radar scopes. While this was happening, the reporters who had gathered at the control tower were ordered out, ostensibly because communication techniques with an interloper were confidential, and this seems to have been a rather weak excuse to clear the tower of the press, since it was perfectly possible for anyone with a radio set to listen in on such communications. According to British researcher Jeannie Randalls, the real reason was that the Blue Book personnel must have suspected that they were on the brink of securing absolute proof of the interplanetary nature of UFOs and were anxious to evaluate what happened next before informing the press. This final proof, however, never came. As the jet interceptors, which had been joined by two more from Newcastle Air Force Base, approached the unknown targets, the targets vanished from the screens only to reappear when the F-94s had passed. Eventually, the jets ran low on fuel and were forced to return to base. The unidentified targets then began to leave the scopes. Although Major Fortnett and Lieutenant Holcomb remained in the control tower until 5:15 a.m. Eastern, no more targets were detected. At a press conference held 2 days later, Major General John Sanford, Director of Air Force Intelligence, presented the Air Force's conclusions on the invasion of Washington. The anomalous radar targets were, he said, almost certainly caused by atmospheric phenomenon, to be precise, temperature inversions. The visual sightings could most reasonably be accounted for stars and meteors, which in the excitement had been assumed to correspond to the false radar images. This had not been the conclusion reached by those in the control tower at the time of the sightings, however. Dewey Fortnett felt that the radar tracks were very probably caused by solid metallic objects. In addition to this, it is reasonable to assume that experienced radar operators might be qualified to distinguish between false targets caused by temperature inversions and those caused by large, solid objects. Indeed, according to Fortnett, there were weather-related targets present on the scopes, and the operators had no difficulty in spotting them. Although the press were fairly satisfied with the official Air Force explanation, Ruppelt, Fortnett, and Chop were certainly not. As Jeannie Randalls reminded us, Ruppelt left the Air Force less than 3 years later to write a book confirming his belief in the reality of alien spacecraft. Fortnett resigned to join a leading civilian UFO group, and Chop resigned to work on a Hollywood documentary dealing with UFOs. The Mckinleyville photographs. As mentioned earlier, there is a large catalog of photographs taken by people from all over the world, allegedly depicting anomalous aerial objects, While many of them are no more than vague smudges that could have mundane explanation, including flaws on the film and lens flare, some are much more impressive. There are many photographs depicting definitively structured, disc-shaped objects, apparently in flight near the witnesses. In cases such as these, there seems to only be two conclusions that can be drawn. Either the photographer hoaxed the pictures with a small model or through other means, or the pictures really do depict what they are alleged to depict. It should be borne in mind, however, that even if the latter is true, that does not automatically mean that the object photographed is an alien spacecraft. It has also been said that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. The sighting of an intelligently controlled disc-shaped flying object certainly qualifies as an extraordinary claim, but unfortunately, capturing that object on film does not constitute extraordinary evidence. It is another extraordinary claim. Consequently, UFO photographs are often subjected to a battery of comprehensive tests designed to establish whether they can, with reasonable confidence, be said to be genuine. One of the most impressive cases of this kind is the Mckinleyville, Oregon case. On May 11, 1950, a strange object appeared over the small farm of Mr. and Mrs. Trent. Mrs. Trent was out feeding the farm's rabbits when she saw the object gliding soundlessly overhead from the northeast to the northwest. She called her husband, they found their camera, and took 2 photographs of the object from vantage points a few feet apart. The Trents were apparently not greatly perturbed by what they'd seen, since they waited for several days until they had used up the remainder of the film before taking it to be developed. The couple did not attempt to publicize the photographs, and it was only by chance that a local newspaper got to hear about them. The photographs eventually found their way into Life magazine and became world famous. They were included in the U.S. Air Force's Condon Report, which was produced by a team at the University of Colorado, headed by the respected physicist Dr. Edward U. Condon. The findings of the 2-year study, which were published in 1969, were highly skeptical. Indeed, Condon and his chief administrator, Robert J. Lowe, declared their disbelief in UFOs at the very outset, placing their negative conclusions at the beginning of the report rather than the end. Even so, the Trent photographs occupied a unique place in the Condon report as the only ones that resisted all attempts at explanation. According to investigator William K. Hartman, his examination of both the photographs and the scene of the sighting led him to conclude that all factors investigated, geometric, psychological, and physical, appear to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object, silvery metallic, disc-shaped, tens of meters in diameter, and evidently artificial, flew within sight of 2 witnesses. He continued, "It cannot be said that the evidence positively rules out a fabrication, although there are some physical factors such as the accuracy of certain photometric measures of the original negatives which argue against a fabrication." Ground Saucer Watch, one of the most highly respected UFO investigation groups, subjected the photographs to sophisticated computer analysis techniques such as color contouring and edge enhancement. The former technique converted each shade of gray on the Trent's black and white photos into a certain color, which made it easier to pick out details in the images. The latter technique exaggerated the edges of every feature in the image, including blemishes on the film. Thus, it would immediately become evident if the object were a model suspended from a wire. The result of GSW's analysis of the Trent pictures were that object shown was a disc between 65 to 100 feet in diameter and probably made of polished metal. However impressive the Trent's photo may be, they have not escaped the attention of skeptics, most notably Robert Schaefer and Philip J. Klass, the latter the most famous and outspoken of all UFO debunkers. While Hartman maintained that the haze on the photos implied a large distance between the observers and the UFO, part of the figure at least of about 1,400 yards, Schaefer suggested that it might be due to grease on the camera's lens, implying that the object might have been quite close to the camera. For Schaefer, there was an inconsistency in the shadows of the garage, caves appearing on the wall in the photos, and he pointed out that this wall faced east, which suggested that photos were taken early in the morning rather than the evening, as the Trents claim. According to Klaus, it was plausible that the Trents had claimed the time in the evening for their sighting because other farmers would have been out in their fields earlier in the day and would surely have seen any large disc gliding through the sky. No such reports were made. Another investigator, Bruce McCabe, disagreed, claiming that the garage shadows indicated a diffuse light source, perhaps the evening sun reflected off a large cloud. He added that lens grease does not necessarily mean that the object was definitively close to the camera, and claimed that even allowing for lens grease, the Mckinleyville UFO was more than 1,000 yards away from the camera. Klaus pointed to the shift in the attitude of the UFO between photographs as strongly implying that it was indeed a model suspended close to the camera, although, as we have noted, the edge enhancement process would have revealed this. The controversy surrounding the Trent's photographs continues more than 45 years after they were taken and shows no sign of letting up. As the great American anomalist Charles Fort once said, "For every expert, there is an equal and opposite expert," and it is this fact that will guarantee the continuation of the UFO controversy in general in the absence of the final proof for which the world is still waiting. Let's go ahead then and we'll pause that here. This is part 2 of Chapter 1, Close Encounters of the First Kind, from the book called UFO Sightings by Alan Baker. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. As you can see, more cases, right? Close Encounters of the First Kind type, involving seeing things from afar, maybe even seeing things close, but not having any physical experience with them. Instead, it's just evidence or eyewitness type of accounts when it comes to these UFOs. And some of these, again, I have talked about in the past, like the Gorman Dog Fight stood out. I remember talking about that in one of my videos. Interesting to see, again, how close that particular UFO got to George F. Gorman, especially when it came to them almost doing that head-on collision. And then it was interesting about the Lubbock Lights. I believe I have talked about that before as well, too. Sounded familiar. I'll have to check the playlist again. But the idea, again, that you have something here that's very, very large in a V shape being discounted as ducks, like in that case, flying at 900 miles per hour. Also, you notice that theme, right? All of these stories have somebody presenting some weird angle of what it could be. Like, why not? Why not have it be the moon? Why not have it be ducks? Why not have it be some kind of anomalous cloud reflection, stuff like that. Washington invasion, I've definitely talked about. That was one of my videos where it was a surprise to me. I never really heard of that experience until I chronicled it on my video. And amazing that it happened right there, right on the Capitol, right there in Washington, D.C. You would have thought that there would have been a lot more press associated with it. The Mckinleyville photographs, I'll have to double check again. I think I have talked about that, but it'll be interesting to see. If I haven't, it'll make for some good conversation on a future video too. But let me know what you guys think. What do you think about these encounters? Which one was your favorite so far? There's going to be more to chronicle on the next part here. That's why I picked this book, because it not only shows several chapters that are fascinating, but it shows a multitude of encounters, of experiences that are there for each one. So lots of examples to talk about soon. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.